So here's something I would like to read out to you. And it reads basically, besides whatever technical inspiration they can draw from magical lore, techno-pagans are driven by an even more basic desire to honor technology as part of the circle of human life, a life that for pagans is already divine. Pagans refuse Pagans refuse to draw sharp boundaries between the sacred and the profane, and their religion is a frank celebration of the total flux of experience, sex, death, comic books, compilers. I am reading an excerpt from Wired magazine from January 7th, 1995, written by Eric Davis. 1995, of course. That was 22 years ago, and it sounds just like it was written today. And for that matter, here is a special guest I first heard about and heard on Greg Kaminsky's Occulta Personality podcast and Angel Millar's Phalanx Radio podcast, both in the United States. Both magnificently serious at expounding on the occult. Aki's book, Journeys in the Kali Yuga, a pilgrimage from esoteric India to pagan Europe, and hopefully an upcoming translation into English of Holy Europe, written in Finnish, are both a classic, and then you should have it. And here we have him from Helsinki, Finland, to the other side of Europe, here in Murcia, Spain. Aki, welcome to the Spectral Revolution. Tervetuloa Spektrin Falankumokoisen. Hopefully I said that well.
Thank you. Sounds great. I didn't know that you could speak Finnish.
I didn't know I could speak Finnish. Thank you. Welcome to the
Sounded
program.
pretty good.
All right, excellent.
Thank you.
All right, Aki, well, here's the question for our listeners and viewers out there, basically, and being your first time, if I'm not mistaken, being your first time in a Spanish language radio show as ours, tell us who Aki Cederberg is.
Yes. Well, I'm a writer, a traveler, musician, filmmaker from Finland. I have written three books. Journeys in the Kali Yuga, which is the first one. This is in English, should be available everywhere. This is about my time and sort of an initiation into the spiritual tradition of India, or one of the branches of the spiritual tradition in India. Then I have written a book called Holy Europe, and this is so far in the Finnish language only. Mm-hmm. And I'm currently in the process of translating it and in negotiations with a publisher to have it published. And this is a massive book, 400 pages. It has a lot of photography, and this really represents the last sort of 10 years of my life of research, and then writing it. I wrote it for like 5 years. But on a deeper level, I have sought sort of spiritual tradition as a living reality for myself, and tried to hopefully convey some of that to others as well. And perhaps my work could be best sort of described by the words of the otherwise perhaps very obtuse philosopher Martin Heidegger, who said, to be a poet in a destitute time means to attend singing to the trace of fugitive gods. This is why the poet in the time of the world's night utters the holy. And so these are the kind of themes, and this is the kind of the central essence of who I am in terms of my work. I'm also currently the editor-in-chief of a Finnish new magazine, which focuses on art, history, culture, and mythology. Sort of a local magazine. So this is a new venture for me. So in a nutshell, that is what I am. I explore spiritual traditions both in the East and West, and sort of I write from a first-person perspective, sort of subjective perspective. I am not an academic in essence. I'm more of a poet or something like that. I sort of try to find something for myself, and hopefully people could see something of value in it for themselves. But I'm not an ideologue as such, or just a theorist. I try to go to the source and have firsthand experiences with the things I'm seeking knowledge of.
Fantastic. Your book, Journeys in the Kali Yuga, details your own journey, basically, searching for spiritual roots. From your own history, what were you missing, Aki?
Well, the problem between in sort of European paganism is that our lines of ancestral knowledge have been cut. We don't have living traditions in the same way that India can be said to have them. In India, there's I mean, the whole Hinduism, Sanatan Dharma, is an unbroken tradition, and of course it has been diluted over time. But in essence, it could be seen as a continuing pagan tradition. It has not been completely broken by any messianic religion as such. And so I've always been seeking for sort of my spiritual roots and a living tradition since I was a very young man, and I could not find that, or I could see the shortcomings of what we have in Europe, because we don't have living teachers of a living tradition, so we are lacking in authority. And I went then to India to sort of see how this kind of tradition could take form, what it could look like. And I did it not to become an Indian or to adopt the outer trappings of Indian culture, but to enrich my own understanding of my European sort of ancestry and spiritual world, and to see my own spiritual tradition in a better light, in the light of this ancient tradition, which is unbroken. So for me, the Indian experience functions as an analogy, as a mirror, by which I can look at my own landscape behind me and see it in a clearer way.
And talking about India, and this is from my own experience, but only from a work perspective. India, or ancient Bharat, bears such an assault to our Western worldview in general. It wasn't, in my case, it was an honor for me to have a very long conversation with faculty just after an engineering lecture at Ajinkya D.Y. Patil University in the city of Pune. That was back in 2016. Basically, our company launched the Sanjay project using this famous character from the Bhagavad Gita. That made me a member of honor of the university. So the thing here is, in your own experience, then, could you describe your traveling to India and Nepal? Because there's lots of people listening to, in search of meaning, of course, and but you have lived this firsthand.
Yes, it is, of course, a very bewildering experience for any European or Western person to go to India, especially from me coming from Northern Europe, where everything is ordered, everything is on time, everything is clean and sort of sanitized. And then you go into this world which is externally quite chaotic, and sort of fundamentally alien to a person who comes from this world. But then as you sort of start relaxing into India in a way, you start to see that there is a kind of strange order that starts to present itself, and things somehow happen, and the society somehow works. And so, of course, the Indian tradition isn't one tradition. It has several branches, and you can only speak of the thing that you are familiar with. And so for me, it was a delving into the Naga sannyasis tradition, the Naga Babas. They are these ascetic sadhus who are dedicated to Shiva, and they represent the sort of one of the oldest schools and representations of Sanatana Dharma of Hinduism in India. They are considered to be protectors of this ancient lineage and this ancient teaching, which they try to keep unchanged by time. So they do not like adapt it to the times as much. And I delved into their world as much as it is possible for a Western person. I had a guru, and I received an initiation into this tradition. The initiation means that you establish a formal link to a tradition, that you are receiving. You receive a name, you receive these gifts of the tradition, and that you're formally recognized as somehow an associate. So of course I didn't become a sadhu, but I sort of got my foot in the door, and I went as far as I could in the Indian sort of experience, which lasted for me sort of intensely for maybe 10 years. And then at the Kumbh Mela, which is the largest gathering of humans on planet Earth for a spiritual or religious or magical reason, at this Kumbh Mela, I realized that this is sort of the line that I cannot cross as a European. I cannot become an Indian, and I cannot adopt Indian gods, but I need to take the knowledge that I have, or use the knowledge that I have learned, and try to churn it into wisdom, which I could use for the benefit of my own peoples and the gods that are in my own culture and blood. And so that is what I tried to do. So I returned to Europe after my Indian experience, trying to sort of enrich with that perspective my own native tradition and spiritual tradition.
So exactly, your search for meaning, as we were talking about that, brought you back to Europe. In your case, what did you find that you were not able to see before here in Europe? In your new book, Holy Europe, in the process of being translated into English, as I understand, what did you find in all these sacred ancestral places you explored throughout Europe?
You mean in Europe or in India?
In Europe, in this case.
Well, I was trying to find sort of the sort of spiritual center, the pole, the world tree, or the pillar that's sort of the center of the order for Europeans in this sort of traditional sense. Like, what is the mythological center of European, different European cultures, different European peoples, and do they relate to one another? And I, of course, visited many pagan prehistoric sites, pagan sort of surviving sites. There aren't necessarily prehistoric, modern pagan sites. Then I visited various churches, Christian sites, because really Europe is built on a tension between a tension between paganism and Christianity. So they exist often and have existed throughout history side by side. So I tried to visit these places and get an understanding of the sort of sacred dimension of various cultures. I represent sort of 9 different cultures in Europe, from the north to the very south, including actually Spain and Italy and France and even Portugal I have in there. So I tried to sort of find some sort of spiritual center of these places and find what the commonality between these European pantheons are, because I do believe that Europe is a family of nations, that our gods are related, and we are, as a people, have more in common than we have separating us. So I believe that we sort of have a common shared sense of history and culture and destiny, certainly. And so I'm trying to find this center in, I know maybe this sounds obtuse, but I'm trying to sort of describe it on a deeper level than merely I visited places and people, which is obviously what I did, but I was trying to also find something in a deeper way, and also describe not finding, because I'm not trying to give people an ideology. And so the reality of being lost is also a genuine experience, which I wanted to try to share and explore also in this book, that you don't always find, and there are things that are lost, and there's a tragedy in this. You know, we often experience a longing for something that we don't even know what that something is. You know, it's like a ghost limb that you have or something. It's like you remember something, but you're not sure what it is that you remember, and you have a homesickness that is incurable. And so I'm trying to give this sort of poetic picture of our time in Europe as Europeans, because I think that we are kind of lost without this metaphysical center. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And for me, Europe is kind of like something that can one day perhaps be. So I'm not talking about Europe only as a collection of nations and borders, but as something larger, something like bigger than that.
I see. Interesting. In our case, the Abrahamic revelation. I want to be just specific. We're talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in this case. Well, Judaism does not proselytize, but still, the Abrahamic revelation seems to not being able to respond. The numbers are there, but it seems to not being able to respond to the spiritual needs of modern Europeans. So there is not that there seems to be, there actually is a return to the old ways. In your view, what is the problem with this generic term, neopaganism?
Well, I mean, I explore a lot of these problems in the book, and of course, I think I am not a typical pagan. I don't consider myself very comfortable with that subculture, because it is a subculture.
Yes.
But I think that for the first part, we are lacking sort of like high theology in paganism. It's often very superficial, the sort of paganism that is represented. It is sort of childlike, eating up in clothing or imitating past forms of culture which are no longer relevant and meaningful to anybody, at least in a religious way or spiritual way. They might be culturally interesting, but there is a focus on superficialities, on appearances, on forms of yesterday. And I am not interested in that. I'm interested in the inner essence of paganism, because what is important about tradition is not what is historical, it is what is eternal or ageless. And so that is what I am trying to seek in it. And of course, there's been many great critiques of paganism published recently, or in, like, let's say, the last few decades. And I think there needs to be more sort of criticism of this neo-paganism, which is, you know, it's kind of like everything goes, every subjective view is as valid as the next one. There is no authority, there's no common ground between anybody. It's just this sort of ill-conceived nature worship by people who do not actually live in nature. It is like people living in the city and talking about like how they're nature worshippers. And like, okay, you know, I don't think that the people in the past who were actually living in nature behaved like city dwellers, nature worshippers and such. So it's often just incredibly superficial and just centered on superficialities, where I think the genuine pagan soul needs to be expressed in more vital and current and energetic ways, and more sort of theologically deep ways. Like we need to really have more philosophy, more real myth, more ritual, more genuine knowledge and wisdom than this sort of mishmash. But this is the central problem of paganism, which, you know, sort of started me going into India in the first place.
I see. Are you familiar with the concept of archaeofuturism from Guillaume Fay? And now we're not touching on the social-political dimensions of such a concept, but at least the word itself, archaeofuturism, that seems to basically link the past and the future in an age where, especially here in Europe, and all these nihilistic tendency of telling people, well, the only time that is important is the present. And we know the consequences of that. Are you familiar with this concept, Aki?
Yes, I have read Guillaume Fay's Archaeofuturism, if I remember, some years ago. I think it's valid to read him. I think that is a book worth reading. I don't necessarily agree with all his conclusions and ideas, but I do think it's a valid thing to think about. And yes, obviously, the kind of paganism that I advocate is has to be. There's been a term in art movements in Northern Europe called ethnofuturism, which is kind of linking that same thing to this idea that you need to have an ethnos. You need to have like archaic roots deep in your culture, combined with a sense of a destiny or a future, that you cannot go just retro. And the problem with paganism often is that it is merely looking sort of backwards, but not looking forwards or being in the current time. Now, I need to say that I am not like I am not a political actor in essence. I work in the realm of culture and spirituality and art and things like that. So I believe that spiritual tradition has the capacity to unite people. I do think that is one thing that sort of can gap people's dichotomies and oppositions to one another on a higher plane and a higher level. So when I consider these spiritual matters and cultural matters in the Holy Europe book, I don't think that the thing because it's politically valid or something. So I think it needs to come from a genuine spiritual reason, and I am trying to advocate for something like a genuine pagan soul, a spiritual tradition, not because I think it's going to politically work out. I don't know if it's going to politically work out, but
I see.
It has to come from above in a way.
I read 2 or 3 sentences from an article in Wired magazine, this January 1995, by Eric Davis. It is called "Technopagans Made the Astral Plane Be Reborn in Cyberspace." That's what I read at the beginning of this conversation. So, with regards to that, how should this neo-paganism relate to the what is called the technological convergence? We live in an age right now, basically, that is talking about ethics in artificial intelligence, but they are not saying what kind of ethics, they're just saying ethics. So no specifics at this time. How should neo-pagans or neo-paganism in Europe relate to this technological convergence?
Well, I think that the first thing to maybe consider is that the worldview of paganism is essentially that divinity is immanent. It is present in the world. The world itself is holy and imbued with divinity, or let's say, something like that. That the gods are here, and this is of course, our duty is to care for the earth and be stewards of this planet. And I mean, that gives you an ethical, perspective, I think, to begin with. It is the idea that man is part of nature. He's the steward of nature. and he has to base his ethics on something which benefits the life on Earth. And of course, this is very vague, and you can interpret this in of course, a myriad of different ways. I don't believe in this sort of, we cannot abandon technology, we should embrace technology. I'm very sort of inspired when I see sort of pagan or with technology in ways, in culture and in art, in archaeology, for instance. There's some sites in my book which were quite sort of futuristic in their construction, but they also reflected in these futuristic ways ancient concepts and symbols and things that had a vital force. So I do think that we need to embrace technology in a way, but technology without being rooted into the earth and into a spiritual tradition, which would give us some sense of center, and ethics, of course, which are eternal in these pagan paths. There's always ethics. It's hubris. We need to be rooted. Otherwise, it's, you know, we are gonna get burned. So I'm not one of these, you know, Eric Davis types. You know, he's from Los Angeles, very smart guy, but, you know, sort of gimmicky. And it's not very rooted what he's speaking about. So I think that we need to be rooted into the earth and the land and the culture, and those things can guide us in our sort of ethical choices. And yes, of course, we cannot turn ourselves away from technology. We need to embrace it, but we need to have it in a service of humanity and the planet, and not vice versa.
And just like, if I remember correctly right now, the god Odin's ravens, Haugen and Maunen, one being called memory, the other being called thought. Well, one can relate to each one of those as culture and technology as well. Technology being the one for the future, and the other one being the part for the past. What does your experience tell you about Europe as a whole? You already mentioned something about Europe being some sort, or intending, or at least that you wish for Europe to be some sort of an entity beyond borders, its own borders. How do you see it as a whole in the immediate future, of course?
Well, I think the European people are the most sort of lost in an inner way of the peoples I know. I think we have still some sort of earthly power. We have material affluence and things like this, but internally we have sort of lost our compass. We have forgotten who we are as peoples, and some change has to happen. Some sort of inner, maybe spiritual isn't even the right word, maybe it's an inner change, but something needs to happen for Europeans to sort of awaken to the fact that they are heading for an abyss, and they're standing on the brink of a disaster which they can no longer come back from, and remember who they are and embrace who they are. I think paganism is essentially about memory and about knowing, and I think that has to happen for Europeans. Maybe it's bound to happen when things get bad enough. I don't know, but that is necessary for Europeans if we are to survive the things that face us as Europeans. I don't have any political vision of the future. I just think that Europeans spiritually and culturally have a common destiny, and they are a family, and there is something that I recognize as Europe and European, and I love it, and I'm very fond of it. And this book that I have written for it is come from my love of European culture and the European peoples. And I don't like seeing what I find is happening to Europe. It is not a good direction in which Europe is heading, culturally, spiritually, materially. And of course, you know, I think we should head for something better, but I think we need a new vision, and we need to be awakened internally. And maybe that takes form in something that you and I don't know yet. Maybe we are just sort of in this in this period in between of a dying Christianity and the emergence of something new which we can't even see. But it has to be informed by the past. We cannot cut off the past. And I am, by the way, not even advocating, necessarily against Christianity or something. Yes, Christianity is part of Europe, but we need something. We need a spirit, a revival of the spirit.
Indeed. Any chance we will have Journeys in the Kali Yuga at least translated into Spanish?
I think somebody already has translated into Spanish. I think it's online. If you search for it, some bootleg. Okay. And I don't know. I heard that the Spanish isn't necessarily that good. Okay. But if you look for it, you might find it. But it's not officially sanctioned by me. I would, of course, like to check the translation before something like that is released. But.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, Aki, coming to the end of our interview, any future projects you would like to share with us?
Well, right now I'm engaged in translating the Holy Europe book, and I want to have that out for the English language world. And that's really been my main work for the past many years. I've put everything I had into this book, both in terms of my own life and finances and everything. There's no sense in writing a book like this and taking years to write something like this. So it has been a sort of a magical project of my own, and I really hope to have it for the English readers as soon as possible in a kind of edition that it deserves. So that is the main thing I'm working on right now.
Excellent. Okay, so here you have it, our dear listeners and viewers. This is Aki Cederberg. We're going to share the website and the links where you can, well, at least if you don't speak Finnish like I do, that you can purchase a copy of Journeys in the Kali Yuga. It's a magnificent book I knew about several years ago through our maybe common friends. I met Angel Millar in New York back in 2018, if I remember correctly, and Greg Kaminsky, of course. Thank you very much for being with us, Aki.
Thank you. It was nice being here.
And we will continue with our program tonight.